Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 21 of our History of Warfare series, where Terminal Philosophy and I will be discussing the Greco-Punic Wars, a little known, but I think very interesting aspect of Hellenic warfare that often gets overshadowed by the Persian Wars and, of course, Rome's war with Carthage. But in a lot of ways, this sort of sets the stage and sort of creates a certain set of expectations we have of Carthage that will explain why Rome had such a very difficult time bringing Carthage to heel. I think the first thing to mention is a sort of just brief overview of the themes of the Sicilian conflict. Because Sicily is an island and Carthage has to get there from Africa, naval warfare is one of the most important aspects of this conflict. Whether it's Carthage invading Sicily or the Greeks trying to interdict those ships, or Agathocles' invasion of Africa, which we'll get to in another lecture. Control of the sea is very important. As we'll see throughout the ancient warfare, control of the sea doesn't mean the enemy can't use it to invade you. Because these ships had to be brought ashore at night, they couldn't be kept out at sea in perpetuity like ships of sail could be. It was a lot harder to prevent enemy from making a do or die naval expedition to your territory, like Agathocles did. But sea power is key. That's the most important thing for control of Sicily. Sieges tended to outnumber battles. A lot of the ancient sources report a lot more sieges than battles. And in that regard, it tends to look a lot more like the Middle Ages, where the Middle Ages tend to have a priority of sieges over battles. We also see that quite early on, both the Carthaginians and the Greeks, unlike the mainland Greeks, had a combined arms perspective. We know that Galon, the Syracusan, had heavy infantry. The Hoplites, he had cavalry, as we'll see at the Battle of Himera. And Polyaenus reports that he had archers. So he had a full combined arms force. Carthage had a full combined arms force where they had, Balearic slingers, Spanish mercenaries, which used sword and javelin. They had Italian mercenaries, which also used swords and javelins, and they had chariots and their own citizen militia, most likely armed in the hoplite fashion. And so we see right out of the gate that the Greeks and Carthaginians have a very combined arms approach. So they're coming from a more advanced military background than, say, Sparta or Athens at the time of the Persian Wars. Logistics seem to be the key problem for both sides, keeping troops fed and supplied and avoiding disease. Disease seems to be killing more troops and armies than actual battles. And that seems to be Carthage's main Achilles heel. While they can win at sea and take cities and give as good as they got on land battles, it's feeding the troops and not getting dysentery that seems to be their Achilles heel. But we also see in the first half of the conflict more of a total war idea where no quarter is asked, prisoners are killed, cities are all put to the sword. But in the second half, I think we see both sides realizing that's a little bit overkill, and there's no point in conquering a wasted city if you can't tax it or recruit from it. And so they mellow out a little bit. They make it a little more humane as the campaign goes on. And lastly, what I'll add is that Carthage continues to develop and refine, as well as Syracuse, their military prowess. We see a lot of this with Dionysus, and we'll get to him at the end of this lecture. But they're through this constant back and forth. They're both innovating and developing new techniques, new strategies, which we see the Persians utterly incapable of doing in the East. And so those are what I would say are the big strategic takeaway from the 150-year conflict. Terminal Philosophy, what is your thoughts on the overview of big ideas of the conflict?
Right. Well, I think that's a great introduction. Unfortunately, the Sicilian Wars have been buried by the more popular conflicts of antiquity, and you don't see much in the public consciousness to sort of rekindle its legacy. Most people think of Hannibal when Carthage is brought up in conversation. As you and I have discussed before, when we were younger, we were both more or less anticipating the release of, highly funded TV series or more in-depth strategy video games that would more rigorously explore many of the wars of antiquity in the Middle Ages. However, those productions never quite materialized at the level we were expecting, so it would seem that we'll have to make do with Kingdom of Heaven and Game of Thrones and the Lord of the Rings films for the time being. Anyways, yes, in terms of our series here, we're going backwards in time briefly so that we don't miss out on the Sicilian Wars and the early days of the Carthaginians. I think it's important to point out here that the Carthaginians came from the Phoenicians who, after the Bronze Age collapse, enjoyed a period of expansion westward in the Mediterranean that lasted for about 300 years. And they settled as far as the Strait of Gibraltar and the southern Iberian Peninsula. So the Phoenicians built higher quality ships than many of their rival powers during the Bronze Age collapse. So much of their expansion into the Mediterranean was uncontested as far as trade and settlements are concerned. And by the time the Greek city-states were colonizing parts of the Mediterranean and Sicily, the Carthaginians at this point had many smaller settlements and trading outposts established beforehand. But as we'll see here shortly, we'll come to discover that the armies of Carthage, well, what makes Carthage sort of interesting, and what you had mentioned before, is that as I was studying for this episode, Carthage was really forced to develop its own combined arms, tactics, and strategies because they were sort of they were just so far away from the events of the Aegean world that they didn't really develop the same exact tactics and strategies that the Greeks were developing against the Persians during, being invaded multiple times by the Persians in the 4th century BC. So, as you had mentioned earlier, Carthage seemed to develop their own combined arms tactics through recruiting, Italian mercenaries, either from Corsica or Sardinia, the Iberian swordsmen, of course, its own citizen militia, high-quality cavalry. They received much of their own copper and silver from Iberia. And I think here, made a good point too earlier on, where much of Carthage's weaknesses throughout the early stages, well, really all throughout the 150 years, is really logistics, like not dependable logistics, as it was really around the second or third Sicilian War, where Carthage had began to develop more agriculture around the area of modern day Tunisia. And there was a lot of logistical challenges and a lot of disease and several disasters at sea, especially losing their cavalry units before the Battle of Himera. But yeah, so Carthage was really forced to kind of get its own act together, but I think they did it fairly well, kind of following the combined arms traditions of other rival powers. So I thought that was interesting about the Carthaginians, and at least despite some of these challenges, especially disease, at least they had a lot of experience in exploring by they explored a lot of the Mediterranean on their own, and they funded a lot of interesting expeditions, and so I think they had some unique advantages on their side. I think I'll leave it at that.
Before we move into the First War, one other point I want to bring up is that a rather surprising discovery was that a lot of the independent Greek city-states of Sicily viewed Carthage more as a benefactor than Syracuse. And that was actually surprising to me. I would have thought that the Carthaginians would have been viewed as barbarians. And to some extent they were, but in a way that was different than the Persians. Like they're like a higher cut of barbarian almost. But if we look at the First War, which culminates in the Battle of Himera, briefly speaking, the 100 years prior to that, so this is like around 480, the Greeks are settling southern and eastern Sicily, and the Carthaginians are settling northern and western Sicily. There is some overlap, but that's the broad general direction. This is the Greek power is centered in cities like Acracis, Gela, and Syracuse. Carthage's power is in the far west at Matia, and that's sort of where the settlements develop. The main impetus for this war is There was a tyrant of Gela named Hippocrates who consolidated the control over southern and eastern Greece. He died in his attempt to take Syracuse. His successor Gelon finished the alliance and conquered Syracuse, and then allied with the tyrant of Acracus, Theron, to solidify his control of the region. The Carthaginians had allied with the city of Himera and other Greek city-states in the region. One of them was Selinus, which will come in importantly in this battle later on. And what happens is the tyrant of Himera, Terillus, is ousted in a coup de main by Theron, and then he appeals to Carthage for help. So then Carthage, under its general Hamilcar, sends an expeditionary force, which Diodorus Siculus says was about 300,000. Now, one of the things that if you look at Diodorus Siculus, he uses two sources, Ephorus and Timaeus. Timaeus, throughout these campaigns, generally gives the Carthaginian forces at 100,000. Ephorus tends to go from anywhere to 200 to 300,000. So it seems that Ephorus is more of a partisan for the Greeks and wants to make the Carthaginian forces look bigger so that their defeats at the hands of the Greeks look better. Timaeus tends to have a more conservative 100,000 figure. And one wonders if the 300,000 that Diodorus is using is a figure he got from Ephorus. So maybe we could say it was 100,000 instead of 300,000. But it was still a massive force that the Carthaginians were sending. And basically, Hamilcar set up two camps. There was a naval camp to protect his ships and an inland camp on the heights overlooking Himera. What's interesting is this camp was fortified, and this is a running theme that the Carthaginians have fortified camps. One wonders if that's where the Romans got the idea, because the Greeks were not in the habit of fortifying their camps. Theron was holed up in Himera, and then Gelon, he sent for Gelon to aid him and help. And so as he's being besieged and contained and waiting for reinforcements, Gelon appears. Gelon, being a cavalry commander under the late Hippocrates, understands the importance of cavalry and launches a series of hit-and-run raids on the Carthaginians in order to disrupt their supply lines, because he seems to understand that Carthage has a weakness in logistics. And by attacking their foragers and disrupting them, he's able to undermine the power base of the Carthaginians. And in one of those fluke incidents in history, he captures a messenger to the Carthaginians from one of their Greek allies, Selenius. And it says that we're sending cavalry reinforcements. And Gelon sees this as a golden opportunity to cut the head off the snake, and gives the letter to his own cavalry troop and sends them to the naval camp where Hamilcar is, and says, hey, we're the reinforcements. So, using Obi-Wan Kenobi Jedi Force power, these are the reinforcements you're looking for. And the Carthaginians let him in. They stab the general and kill him. They burn the ships and cause mayhem. And at the same time, in order to take pressure off Theron, he attacks a fortified camp on the hill. Initially, he's successful, but as his troops turn to looting, the Iberian mercenaries, according to Polyaenus, attack, and his troops are cast into disarray. And then Theron attacks, casting the rest of them in disarray. And on top of all of this, the Carthaginian forces see their own ships on fire, and they're like, yeah, it's over. And they just run. And Gelon has ordered that no prisoners be taken. And they're massacred. And then some escape, but to Carthage, but others escape to the Greek allies. And this consolidates Greek power in Sicily for 50 years. Carthage is completely crushed in this. They fear an invasion from Sicily, and they treat with Gelon to make peace. But Gelon has no interest in invading Carthage. He just wanted to consolidate his ally Theron's power, and is able to then usher in a golden age for both Syracuse and Acracus. The one interesting point is we don't really know how Hamilcar died. As I mentioned, Diodorus Siculus says that he was killed by the Gelon's cavalry, but Herodotus says he committed he burned himself on a funeral pyre as a human sacrifice to the gods to grant victory. And Polyana says he was killed in an ambush by Gelon's archers as he was offering sacrifice that he had been invited to participate in. I think that it's most likely that Diodorus' account is closer to the truth, since Herodotus's and Polyaenus's, I think, don't seem to show the same care and attention to what's going on in the actual battle that Diodorus does, and that they're not utilizing all the historical resources available to them. So that's the first Sicilian War. What are some of your thoughts on that, terminal philosophy?
Right. Well, I think that's that's a great summary. It's before the battle had begun at Himera. It's interesting that after the rise and sort of consolidation of power made possible by Hippocrates, and after he died, it's interesting and somewhat jaw-dropping to learn that Galon, who ruled over Syracuse, liquidates something like 3 or 4 or 5 settlements and forces their population to move to Syracuse. And that's sort of what makes Syracuse one of the main urban centers for Sicily at the time. I thought that was just, it's almost like this like iron-fisted total war tactic. Very, very interesting and I don't know. Yeah, quite a brute tactic. I tend to agree with you. I think your battle summary is totally accurate. It was sort of a kind of a classic and almost kind of a cliche thing that the messenger from Carthage was captured, and that created this opportunity for the Greek cavalry to deceptively pull off this ruse, where they say, "Hey, we're the reinforcing cavalry," and they basically destroy the sea camp that Carthage had set up, and ended up killing Hamilcar. Which I tend to agree with you that the Diodorus theory is probably more correct. There's some competing theories that he had committed suicide as a sacrifice to the gods out of embarrassment or out of shame. But I tend to think that Diodorus is probably the best source available for some of these. I think for the Sicilian Wars in general, because as we had discussed earlier, it's difficult to tell whether or not Herodotus showed much interest in the Sicilian Wars. And, many of Herodotus's figures, I think, while definitely they can be contested in some of the Greco-Persian conflicts, they can absolutely be probably brought even under more scrutiny with the Sicilian Wars, given what Diodorus had mentioned. But yeah, I mean, here on both sides we see, good implementation of both combined arms. However, that's especially interesting to note this in antiquity, that when intelligence is captured by one side, I mean, regardless of however robust one force might be, I mean, that can turn the tide so easily. So, and that's exactly what happened to Hamilcar's force. And as a result, I mean, it was unfortunate that, he lost most or all of his cavalry on the way to Himera before they even landed. And he was just kind of sort of at a disadvantage there. And I think too that the Hellenistic side of Sicily had the benefit of probably importing more tactics from the Greek city-states than Carthage did. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to make these distinctions between military doctrine, because Carthage being isolated from the Greco-Persian wars and the various wars happening further east in the Mediterranean, they never really had the benefit of sharpening their skills in these large and drawn-out battles. Whereas by the time the Greeks were doing battle with Carthage, there were some lessons learned, and probably some logistical systems had been tightened, but I think basically the first Sicilian War. I mean, Carthage is basically humiliated, and the Himera is brought under control of the Greeks, and basically Carthage starts to sort of settle the area around modern day Tunisia and starts getting its agriculture more together, and they started importing a lot more copper and silver from Iberia at this point, sort of in a rebuilding phase. So I think that's a fair summary of the First Sicilian War.
Now, it what we can say is that the defeat of the Carthaginians at Himera was so crushing that for 70 years they did not try to avenge that defeat in Sicily. So even whatever the numbers of the Carthaginian forces were, it was a crushing defeat, one that took at least 3 generations for them to even envision doing anything again. And it's also important to understand that the alliance of Acracus and Syracuse had to first be broken, or if not broken, at least distracted. And the way that happened was the backdrop to the Second Sicilian War is the Peloponnesian War and the Athenian expedition. So, going back to our Peloponnesian War series, the Segestians had asked Athens for aid. Or first Carthage, and the Carthage said no, and then Athens, and Athens like, yeah, we'll help. Then they fight Sicily, or Syracuse. So at this point, Acracus and Himera and the other cities cannot rely on Syracuse for aid because Syracuse is being besieged by the Athenians. And Segesta is still getting defeated by Selinus, and Carthage is like, okay, we'll come to help. So this is interesting, right? These barbarian force, these Carthaginians, are being asked to help by a Greek city-state. So again, it's something you would never see in Greece where they'd say, hey, Persia, come and help us. Never going to happen in Greece. So it does show you the different dynamics going on here. And Hannibal Mago, who's basically on a quest for revenge to expunge the memory of Himera because his grandfather fought there and died, Hamilcar. And so he basically just goes on a rampage, just destroying city after city. There really aren't any battles to speak of. They're all sieges. And what's interesting is this is consistent with our discussion that we made about the Assyrians and even the Hellenic siege warfare of the Alexandrians. We see all the usual things, battering rams with iron caps and protected bodies for the men to roll the ram under the wall to knock it down, siege towers to pour fire onto the walls from positions higher above to suppress the troops, to then bring down ladders. And this highly refined Near Eastern siege technique, which they inherited from the Assyrians and the Persians, they used to systematically reduce numerous cities. They reduced Selinus, they reduced Himera, and they ultimately reduced Acracus. The 2 interesting points here is at the Battle of Himera, they are attacking the Himeran forces. Hannibal is. He will later die in a plague. There's a small reinforcement from Syracuse that attacks the Carthaginians under Hannibal, and he's thrown into confusion, and the Himerans launch a sortie. But the other camp, led by Hamilcar, another Hamilcar, it's a common Carthaginian name, sees this chaos going on, and the Greeks think they've won. And Hamilcar comes in and just wipes them out. And then Himera is burned to the ground, avenging the loss 70 years earlier. After that, they're done. They think that they're done. But then Syracuse starts raiding Carthaginian territory in 406, so they attack again. And this time they play for keeps. They're going to take Acracus, which is, of course, the city that Theron, who started the whole conflict, that was his city. And at this point, Hannibal dies. I'm pretty sure it's due to diseases. And the Carthaginians are successful mostly until they run out of food. And then the threat of disease rears its ugly head. And again, we see this logistical issue here. But Hamilcar, being a savvy and wily general, sees that in the siege of Acracus, there's a fleet of supplies being sent by Syracuse to reinforce the city. In order to buy time, he takes the gold and the treasure from his own native Carthaginian forces to pay the mercenaries and said, just wait a little bit longer, we're going to get some food, and we're going to take the city out. So he launches a naval operation, surprise attack, takes the Syracusan supply fleet out, which kills 2 birds with 1 stone. It starves the city, and it feeds his army and staves off disease, and they sack and destroy Acracus. And pretty much the Greeks are left desolate. I mean, Carthage totally avenged its defeat in 480, And Syracuse is in no position to counterattack because they've just barely fended off an Athenian invasion. And Carthage can go home with spoil and bragging rights. So, what are your thoughts on the Second Sicilian War?
Right. Well, yeah, here in the Second Sicilian War, we definitely see the reemergence of Carthage forces, and in essence, as you had just mentioned, they get their vengeance and sack and destroy uh, Himera. And what you have with that is you kind of see a more disorganized Syracusan forces. As you mentioned before, after that battle, there was the Syracusan forces and other states or other cities close to that started raiding Carthage territory, in which case the Carthaginian response to that essentially created the siege of Acragas, and that was also another Carthaginian victory. So, I mean, this is basically a complete turning of the tide, at least for Carthage, and I think we see at least probably some better logistics and some better use of combined arms here. But I think really it also comes down to the sort of disorganized military situation as well as the political situation for Syracuse and sort of its Athenian support. And so I think, but it with the Second Sicilian War, I mean, right? You kind of have more sieges than you do open battles out in the field, and this is almost more reminiscent of. I mean, you could say two things: either more like almost like Assyrian things, just like waiting for cities to starve out, or this is kind of almost more reminiscent of battles sometimes in the Middle Ages. So one thing that you had mentioned earlier that I thought was kind of interesting is, did the Romans get their idea of fortified camps from the Carthaginians? And I did spend some time looking into that, and unfortunately, the information was fairly sparse. And maybe there's a listener who will hear this who has some information on that, but it was difficult to find much information on that. Both Diodorus and Herodotus didn't necessarily have much in the way of that I could find, but I think that that's not a bad. I don't think that's a bad theory necessarily because it's hard to tell as to whether or not by the time Pyrrhus was going to war much later with the Romans, by that time fortified camps were certainly a thing used by both sides. So I think that as far as I can tell, the first use of fortified camps seems to be in the Sicilian Wars here. So, unless there's better earlier examples, I don't think. I mean, for example, I don't think the Persians were doing that. I don't think the early Greek city-states were doing that. I don't know that the early Phoenicians were doing that. So, I think maybe for the time being, it's not a bad hypothesis to say that Carthage can be sort of credited for that. But yeah, I mean, this is a complete turn of events for Carthage, and yeah, it sort of left Syracuse in a kind of a battered state because. Yeah, they're both trying to deal with Athens as well as Carthage at the same time.
Now, the next major conflict is a series of wars led by Dionysus, the tyrant of Syracuse. Now, one of the reasons why Dionysus is so intent on fighting wars with Carthage is in his Henry IV moment. According to Diodorus Siculus, as a tyrant, he's afraid of being ousted by his own people, and that the city-states of Sicily will defect to Carthage to avoid his tyrannical rule. So that tells you a lot about how ruthless this guy was. And that the only way to unite his people and the Greeks under his rule was to have a common enemy, which is exactly what Henry IV tells his son at the end of the play, Henry IV. So, taking a page from Shakespeare before it was written, or maybe Shakespeare took a page from Dionysus, he starts a war with Carthage. Now, we mentioned in another episode the siege developments that Dionysus invented. He invented catapults and these missile-throwing devices, which we don't need to necessarily get into again. And he also transformed naval warfare by inventing quadrimes and quinqueremes. So a quadrime and a quinquereme are ships that have 4 and 5 banks of rowers, respectively. The main advantage that these ships offer over the trireme is they can have more marines for boarding because they're bigger. especially quinqueremes. They can also mount catapults. They can mount missile weapons and towers to fire at enemy installations. So, and furthermore, it's just a bigger ram. If you do ram into a trireme, you're just going to break it to pieces. So these give him an advantage at the beginning of the conflict, and he takes out. He goes for the Carthaginian center of power, Madia, and takes it by storm. Basically, it's an island like Tyre, and using a tactic that later Alexander the Great would use 60 years later to take Tyre, he builds two moles out towards, with siege towers on them, out towards the city. So in a way, we see a level of sophistication that is really without parallel anywhere else in the world for siege warfare. And he also controls the sea with his new naval developments. So this city's holding out. They're on what Sun Tzu calls death ground, because Dionysus' troops are going to put them all to the sword to get revenge for the Second Sicilian War. Dionysus doesn't want to do that because he wants to sell them into slavery, but he can't control his troops. So one of the things that he does to break through this tough resistance is a night attack where his elite troops place ladders against a certain portion of the housing on the wall that they're able to scale over and then create a way in for the rest of his army, which leads to a general massacre. This leads to a Carthaginian attack, which comes in overwhelming force, such overwhelming force that Dionysus decides that it's best to retreat back to Syracuse, where almost all of its gains are undone. Problem is, Carthage is again beset by disease and plague. Not being able to feed a large army is not a good idea in antiquity, because you end up with disease and plague. And so it sort of hampers them as they're moving towards the city. What ends up happening then is there's a naval battle at Catana where the Syracusans are defeated by Carthage. And what's interesting is Diodorus Siculus makes it very clear that this is a land battle at sea. It's what the ships are so closely packed together, which is funny because that's exactly what the Romans would do 200 years later, and it would ruin the Carthaginians. They couldn't fight a land battle at sea. But it just goes to show the prowess of the Carthaginian fighting soldiers, that they can go toe-to-toe with hoplites on a boarding engagement and win. Compare that to Salamis, where the Persians got destroyed. They then blockade the city, and Mago besieges Syracuse. Syracuse is being besieged by the Carthaginians. And one of the things that's interesting here is Hamilcar and Mago camp on the same swamp the Athenians did, and have exactly the same fate as the Athenians. Disease and plague ruin their army. It looks like they weren't paying attention during the last war. But what's interesting is, in order to keep his throne, he basically allows the Carthaginians to escape. Dionysus says, look, I can't let your mercenaries escape, but the freeborn citizens, including you, Hamilcar, can leave. But you just got to pay me all the loot that you looted from Sicily. And they're like, yeah, sure, we'll do that. And they leave. And then the war's over, because the Carthaginians are bankrupt and out of resources. Dionysus is in a really precarious position. Not really good. But what's interesting about the first Dionysian War is that, again, we see very sophisticated siege techniques. We see Carthage being hampered by its lack of logistics. And we see the utter ruthlessness of these tyrants. And it becomes easy to understand why a lot of these Greek city-states ended up viewing Carthage as their benefactor.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Here with the Third Sicilian War, we see the emergence of Dionysus, and and after I don't know how long the peace treaty was between the second and third war. However, I think Dionysus definitely broke that peace treaty with the beginning of the siege of Matia, and he ended up capturing it. However, those gains were shortly lost, and I think as you had mentioned earlier, you have the emergence here of a more elaborate siege tactics, and what you have too. I think in southern and eastern Sicily, what you have is really see a sort of a long and interesting history of a lot of revolts. And when I was studying this subject, I mean, all of the rulers of these cities are referred to as local tyrants. And yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think all throughout this time, I mean, regardless of the peace treaties that were agreed upon by Syracuse and by Carthage, you really just have a brutal treatment of the Sicilian populations. And so, yeah, what you mentioned earlier, I completely agree with. It's no wonder that many of these people had viewed Carthage favorably. So, but yeah, I think Dionysus, he just really couldn't. He couldn't raise enough forces to really drive Carthage off of the island. And but at the same time, Carthage was dealing with its own sort of insurrections in North Africa, and also what you had mentioned earlier, which is important, which I did come across as well, is that they were dealing with a lot of financial issues. They just couldn't wage war on the scale that they wanted to. I think one interesting battle here of the Third Sicilian War is obviously the Battle of Catana, which Diodorus Siculus mentions that, yeah, because of how close these ships were together, it was basically a land battle on sea. And so I think this is especially where Carthaginian military doctrine really shines, because again, as we had mentioned earlier, they have a great variety of different mercenaries from different parts of the Mediterranean, especially the swordsmen from Iberia, and many of their Italian mercenaries from Sardinia were they were very sought after by Carthage, and I think they're definitely played the most important role here with the Battle of Catana. And honestly, I don't think because Syracuse and sort of its supporting cities and tyrants, there was never a effective and organized and consolidated structure of power to raise the amount of forces that they needed to actually confront Carthage. And I really do think that that's kind of the summary here. But of course, Carthage dealt with another bad round of disease, killing several of its own commanders as well. And so they thought, well, that it was just another. Basically, it was agreed upon to have another peace treaty, and so. But of course, it's definitely it's unquestionable that Carthage came out on top in the Third Sicilian War. But again, when you look at these different wars, it's really only about like one or two maybe major battles, and then it's just accented by a series of either sieges or one or two naval battles, which Carthage just outright completely obliterates the Syracusans. So yeah, it's honestly just like one or two battles per each of these wars, and Carthage definitely has probably the slight upper hand. And I think you had an interesting analogy earlier before we started this stream, where you had mentioned that Carthage doesn't quite get the credit it deserves historically, but I think here in the Sicilian Wars, if we were thinking of this as a boxing match, they kind of win by points, despite not really being able to deal a knockout blow in any one particular setting or event.
Yes, the one brief detour from the Dionysian conflict is why is Sicily so strategically important? Why is there all of this fighting over Sicily? Well, one thing that we know is that Sicily, much like Egypt and Carthaginian North Africa, was considered a rich breadbasket. And Sicily fed Rome, and during Rome's many tumults and civil wars and revolts, the fate of Sicily was very important in determining who would win, because that determined who could feed Rome. And given that at the time both Syracuse and Carthage were metropolitan cities, it behooved both of them to control the island's resources for foodstuffs. The other thing we know is that in a way similar to Thessaly and Macedonia in Greece, Sicily was great for breeding horses, which is why Cellinius and the city of Cellinius, which was going to bring the horse reinforcements to Carthage at Himera, and Gelon, the cavalry commander of Hippocrates, has this developed cavalry tradition. So again, if cavalry is an important part of your military strategy, then you're going to want to have control of Sicily because it produces these areas, these horses, and it's also centrally situated in the Mediterranean, which puts it in a great position to control trade, laterally speaking, east to west. So Syracuse is a very decisive island to fight over, and that explains in part why Carthage and Syracuse were willing to engage so often, and even Athens threw in for a little bit, why they were willing to do this. Because it was a very strategically situated island that had natural resources such as horses and foodstuffs, and very wealthy cities because of its situation on the trade routes. So that's in part why Athens and Syracuse and Carthage fought over Sicily. Dionysus, according to Diodorus Siculus, Dionysus's wars against Carthage are purely to stay in power. He needs to unite the Greeks against a common enemy who otherwise would hate him for his tyrannical repressions of murder and theft and everything else that goes with it. So, if anything, the third, fourth, and fifth Sicilian wars, the Greeks are kind of the baddies because they're always picking fights with Carthage. Though technically it's Dionysus doing it, many of the Greeks hate him, and that's why they side with Carthage so often. The second war, from 383 to 376, gets started because he's fighting the tyrant of Brutii in the toe of Italy, who's got colonies in Sicily, and Carthage gets dragged into that as well. Early on, Dionysus scores a victory over Mago at Kabbalah, and then Carthage has to send troops back to Africa because of rebellions. And then Dionysus presses his demands too far, and Carthage can't go along with that because it's like leave the island or else. So after they put down the rebellions in Africa, they come back and defeat him at Cronium in 376. Again, a lot of these ancient battles, there isn't a lot mentioned. We're actually, I think, rather lucky that there was as much on Himera as we get. The only other ancient battle in Sicily that gets anywhere near the detail of Himera is the Battle of Primisus in 339 BC, which we'll get to in the next Sicilian War lecture. And then Dionysus has to pay the Carthaginians 1,000 talents as reparations. So clearly the fourth war again would go to Carthage. Carthage seems to have been the victor by points. And then the fifth Sicilian War was an attempt to take the Carthaginian city of Libyum, which replaced Mahdia as their center of power, and he's also defeated in the siege there. And by the end of these conflicts in 367 BC, it's the status quo ante, which would have been what it was in 404. So, but we have to understand these wars, in one sense, were not meant to be won. Dionysus didn't necessarily need to win these wars. He needed these wars to unite the Greeks underneath his tyrannical rule, because only by fear of a common enemy could he control them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and once again, with the Fourth Sicilian War, you've got about like one or two major battles with Battle of Kabbalah and then Battle of Cronium. But yeah, once again, I think it bears repeating that with Dionysus, there was never an effective system in place that he could either enforce or create right there on the fly to consolidate power of these various city-states or just cities on the eastern portion of Sicily. One important thing that I think you mentioned, that I think that is good here, is that the reason why Sicily is being fought over so much is because it's one of the main Mediterranean breadbaskets, and I forget the name of it, but before the First Sicilian War, there was sort of the cultivation and the rise of agriculture, and I'm probably going to butcher the name. It was like the Catilian Plain or something like that on the southern portion of Sicily, which, of course, had many farms, and this also had a long-standing equestrian tradition too of raising horses. And the third point you mentioned too is that it's just a great strategic location for trade between as far west as the Strait of Gibraltar or as far east as the old Phoenician cities of Tyre and so on and so forth. But I think it was it was just a really crucial place for trade and for agriculture. And I don't think it's any mystery why it was being fought over. But as far as Dionysus goes, yeah, there was never anything he could never consolidate power, and he didn't have the money. There was also, by the time the Fourth Sicilian Wars were coming around, as far as Diodorus Siculus is concerned, Dionysus just did not have the money to really sustain anything long against Carthage. And I think what the hope was for both of these sides was to somehow deal some sort of knockout blow in a chance in at least one battle. But of course, that never really happened. And all throughout this time as well, even during the Fourth Sicilian War, again, Carthage is dealing with more insurrections in places like Tripoli and in other places in modern day Morocco. Carthage itself had its own political systemic problems of having its own sort of local tyrants, but at least they had an easier time having the upper hand against the Syracusans and Dionysus and all of these sort of isolated, atomized local tyrants that that the what we could call Hellenistic Sicily. That was kind of the best it could muster against Carthage, and so Carthage could at least, well, Carthage would, of course, brutally put down its own insurrections, but at least they were on the winning side and sort of had the momentum to go with there. So I think that was, that's a fairly interesting thing to consider. But yeah, I mean, really, here throughout the Sicilian Wars, I mean, at least up until the fourth Sicilian War, it ends in a peace treaty. And Dionysus is forced to pay 1,000 silver talents as reparations. And and Carthage, it's still a very similar situation. Carthage is still firmly in control of Western Sicily, and places like I forget the name of the original city, but it would later be renamed Palermo, which in the famous war film Patton, Patton discusses how Palermo is one of the most conquered cities in the world. Then, of course, he starts listing off all the powers that had traded hands with it, and so. Yeah, again, Dionysus just never had this a political system in place or a military system in place, or the popular support to keep a long and sustained war running in his favor.
Philip II did what Dionysus wanted to do. That's pretty much what ended up happening. Having ended the Dionysian War, one of the things that's interesting looking back on the, say, previous 120 years that we've covered is, unlike the conflicts against Persia over the same time frame, where the Greek historians are constantly praising the valor of the Greek hoplite and Macedonian phalangite over the Persians, giving them victory after victory unbroken, we don't see any of that with Carthage. We don't see any marked inferiority in Carthaginian forces vis-a-vis the Greeks. They give as good as they got. And even more outstandingly, given Syracuse's close ties to Sparta, as we saw at the Peloponnesian War, and the fact that many of the mercenaries that Dionysus hired to be his personal muscle were Spartan mercenaries, we find no record of the Spartan military prowess carrying any weight in Sicily. We don't have a 300. We don't have Leonidas. We don't have any of these great moments where the Spartans just overcome impossible odds. They're just one more list of mercenaries amongst the sea of mercenaries hired by both sides. And again, given the unique reputation that the Spartans developed in the Eastern Mediterranean, as being these elite warriors and defeating the Persians again and again and again, the fact that the Syracusans are always hiring them to fight Carthage, and they don't really seem to make a difference one way or the other, they're just more warm bodies on the battlefield, I think really does go to show the military prowess of Carthage. And I think not only Alexander the Great's military reputation, but maybe we need to ask whether Sparta's military reputation, in light of Alexander of Epirus, Alexander the Great's uncle, was the result of fighting women rather than men. The Carthaginians fought like men. Certainly in his Life of Timoleon, Plutarch says the Carthaginian sacred band fought valorously and was in no way inferior to the Greeks. So what we see that the Carthaginian fighting style of their own native troops, along with their elite mercenaries from Spain, the Balearic Islands, and Italy was on parity with the Greeks. And I think one of the reasons why the Sicilian Wars have not been given their due is this sort of mythology of Greek invincibility is easy to maintain when you compare them to the Persians, who do rather abysmally. But when you compare them to the Carthaginians, it doesn't really hold up that well. And it doesn't quite have the same propaganda value that, say, Salamis to Alexander the Great does.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Carthage really doesn't get the credit it deserves for its own place that it held in the Mediterranean. And as you had mentioned before, yes, Syracuse had hired out many mercenaries, not just Sparta, but elsewhere throughout the Mediterranean, even archers from Crete and things like that. So they had outsourced a lot of their mercenaries, and yeah, it's really difficult to come by anything that mentions sort of the martial prowess of the Spartans having any sort of successful battles or campaigning throughout Sicily against the Carthaginians, because there's enough evidence, contemporaneous and otherwise, to suggest that Carthage could really hold its own against the Hellenistic world, because they had developed their own system of successful combined arms tactics and strategies. And I think it's fair to say too that they had a better naval tradition, or at least they had an earlier start on a naval tradition than the Greeks did. Although the the Greeks' main naval competitor early on was the Persians, which, as you had mentioned, that they never fared very well. And we've talked about it again and again, but it was very much a quality versus quantity type of a situation, a Soviet and German situation, if you will, if you don't mind the comparison. But I think it's fair to say that the reason why these Sicilian Wars just don't get talked about very much is because, for one, I think Hannibal is sort of the star of the show when Carthage is concerned, and so he kind of casts a large shadow over these Sicilian Wars. But second, too, it's just like it's not as it's just simply more obscure and not as sexy to discuss. More wars where the Greeks defeat some large, they're outnumbered and they defeat some large opposing force like the Persians. And so I think, for other reasons like, Hollywood and entertainment and video games and things like that, I think the Sicilian Wars unfortunately get left in the dust. But yeah, I think it goes without saying that that Carthage was able to develop its own robust system of siege tactics, of land and naval tactics. They were able to, recruit their own mercenaries, just like the Greek city-states were, and I think they held out. They really just don't get the credit they deserve, and I think they just live sort of in the shadow of the Greek military traditions, and they didn't have, of course, the larger historical and philosophical contributions like Aristotle and Plato and the school at Athens and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think, as you had mentioned earlier, I think it's fair to say that Carthage sort of wins out just by, if we're using the boxing analogy, they win out by points just because they're more consistent, and they simply just had a better navy, and they had a better use. They took advantage of the disorganized situation of Eastern Sicily. I think I'll leave my closing comments at that. But yeah, it's an interesting subject to study for sure.
Yeah, I think what I'll end with is, what's interesting is that, unlike Persia, the Carthaginians were not wholly viewed as barbarians. I mean, after all, Aristotle wrote they had the best constitution of any city in his own time, which is high praise from Aristotle, and something he would certainly not give to a barbarian. The Greek cities of Sicily, more often than not, viewed Carthage as their benefactor rather than Syracuse. And what's interesting as well is, as far as the analogy of the winning by points in a boxing match, when Pyrrhus left Sicily, he said that I have given a field for Carthage and Rome to fight over. And in the First Punic War, Rome is not fighting Sicily or Syracuse for control of Sicily. It's fighting Carthage. So, well, we might get getting a little ahead with that statement, by the end of these conflicts, it does seem that Carthage has gained the upper hand. And then in the next session, we'll deal with Timoleon and Agathocles. So thanks again, Terminal Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.